Welcome back to another episode of the Buried Bible Podcast, where we explore the Bible through the lens of the ancient world. I am one of your hosts, Keegan Walls. My job is to be the curious layman, and we are here with the scholar and the man himself, Mark Chavalas, for another episode. So,
good morning.
Good morning.
Yeah.
Well, exciting. We are going to be doing and jumping into part 3 of the ancient Near East, really setting the stage in the background for you, our listeners, to really understand kind of what's going on behind the scenes, specifically when we're looking at Old Testament stuff, and also hopefully be helpful to you to kind of get a background to how Mark is going to be approaching the Bible. So that when we focus on different topics, when we look at different books, different stories, you can always go back to these episodes, find out a little bit about what's going on, and more of a deep dive into what is the historical context and the approach that we, mainly Mark, is going to be taking to the Bible, specifically the Old Testament. So we are going to jump into part 3. We're going to do our best to catch back up with where we just left off on our last episode, dive in, and then probably in this episode finish up on the ancient Near East. I'm sure in later episodes you can expect to get more things, more cultural references, but again, just kind of setting the stage of what is happening in this old ancient world of the Old Testament in the Bible. That's what our goal is with these episodes. So, Mark, I'll let you jump in and take us back into the ancient world of Mesopotamia and all that's going on.
Well, glad to. When I used to teach a course on Mesopotamia, people would ask me, "Oh, well, what were Mesopotamian women like, or what was their religion like?" And of course, that would be like asking, what was the role of women in Western civilization from Homer to the present? And of course, that would be sort of a ridiculous statement to make. And the same thing is true in Mesopotamia, though the civilization is pretty static from what we've been discussing so far. The Sumerians and the Akkadians in the 3rd and early 2nd millennium. There's actually a whole host of people groups. Part of this, I suppose, is because the floodplain of Mesopotamia is quite wide open. If you have an army and you want to invade Mesopotamia, it's relatively speaking easy. There are no giant mountains to block you. Of course, there's a sea in the south, but if you have a big navy, you can climb in there. And because of this, there really is a multitude of people groups who will invade this area. However, once they invade the area, it's kind of like people groups who invaded China. They become China-fied, if I want to make up a word. And so if you invade Mesopotamia, at some point you take on the attributes of the people group of Mesopotamia. I suppose you could say the Sumero-Akkadian culture, which we talked a little bit about last week. And so I'm going to bring up a myriad of people groups in this relatively brief account over this 3,000-year period. You think about it, 3,000 years is a ridiculously long period of time. What generalizations do you think you could make about 3,000 years? Well, not very many. And so even when I was a student, if I would make a generalization in class, the professor would say, what period are you talking about? And what region are you talking about? And I said something I thought was intelligent. Now you want me to be specific too? Oh, and elegant too is what my professor would tell us to do. And so we had to learn that. In fact, when I learned Akkadian, it took 7 years because you had to learn every dialect, every period dialect. And of course, a lot of this has to do with language, in the sense that language does change over time. So the Akkadian of 2500 BC is dramatically different than the Akkadian of 500 BC. There's a 2,000-year difference. They probably, if I had two of those speakers sitting here, they probably couldn't communicate with each other. The Assyrian dialect and the Babylonian dialect is very different, let alone other language groups. And so let me just sort of give you sort of a summary of the history of the area with featuring some of the main people groups in this region. And remember, Mesopotamia is primarily today the country of Iraq, southwestern Iran, most of inland Syria, when, of course, just to give you an update, of course, Syria is in a big mess right now, politically speaking. And I remember being in there in the 70s and 80s, and it was already percolating then. And so this is sort of an eruption. And even southeastern Turkey, from the Amanus mountain range south into the floodplain of the Tigris and Euphrates, is also part of Mesopotamia proper. So you really have, um, you know, the political landscape of today sort of overlaps. And so, for example, when I was excavating in the 70s in Syria, 70s and 80s, we could excavate in Syria. It was no problem. There was a dictator there who had an iron fist rule, but Iraq was embroiled in a gigantic civil war against Iran. And so there were no excavations in Iraq after 1980, and they didn't start up for well over a generation after that, not just after the war stopped, but because of the social fabric had to be recuperated for the Iraqis to start on their own and then invite foreign archaeologists to come in. Now, of course, Syria has now been a mess because of that. And so we're quite dependent upon the political situation. By the way, that's a tangent, but the whole talk we're doing for the entire podcast is a tangent. So anyway, as we go on, so don't worry about it. So for example, we have Sumerians and Akkadians, and if you remember what I said in the previous episode, those two people groups, I shouldn't say they're two people groups. These are two language groups, because if you're a scribe, you probably are trained in both languages, and you might not even be ethnically either one of them. We have Sumerians, or at least people who are writing Sumerian with Akkadian names. We have Akkadians who have Sumerian names, and of course, the same thing is happening. In our particular context, a lot of us have biblical names, but it doesn't mean that we're Hebrew or Greek or Latin. It's just it's because of our heritage. Or if you have an Anglo name or a Celtic name or whatever it might be, it probably represents something other than ethnicity, because of the complexity of our civilization. Well, Mesopotamia was just as complex, maybe even more so for us, because we just don't understand it very well. So the third people group that we are aware of are the Hurrians, that are in the north, primarily of Syria and Iraq, and we begin seeing Hurrian names in the later part of the third millennium. Very little Hurrian writing has been found, but enough to know that it was completely unrelated to either of these other two writing language groups, Sumerian and Akkadian. Akkadian is a Semitic language, so it will be connected and similar to Biblical Hebrew, Aramaic, and Phoenician, Canaanite, and a few other languages. Modern-day Arabic is also related to it. And so that's a large language family. We English speakers are part of the large Indo-European language family, which is gigantic. And the earliest attested Indo-European language, by the way, is Hittite. And no, they didn't. They wrote in cuneiform, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but their language was related to that. I remember taking my Hittite class, and most of the students that were in the class in graduate school were actually classical scholars, Greek scholars, and they were fine learning the Hittite because they could see lots of the connections. But when they had to learn the script, they were understandably terrified. And remember, there's a difference between language and script. And I think that will come clearer as we go on. You can write any language with any script you want. It might be difficult. I mean, you could write English in cuneiform. In fact, when I first learned cuneiform, I would always try to write my name in it or something. If we would have archaeology sessions for 8 hours at my professor's residence, and you'd have to bring your sack lunch, and I would write my name in cuneiform on it. Thought it was pretty cute. because that's at the time, that's probably all you knew. Anyway, so multitudes of people group, Hurrians, who play a major role for well over a millennium. They are probably the Horites in the Bible, unless they're not. But there's a good chance that there's a connection between those people groups. They don't play a major role, and in fact, they're simply connected to one of the Canaanite groups, which is not simply a language issue, but we'll get into that, or maybe we will if somebody wants to ask a question that I can't answer. Then we have Amorites, and I think I might have brought them up. Abraham is probably ethnically an Amorite. The homeland is in northwest Mesopotamia, which would be in Syria today, inland Syria. And Haran, which is in southeastern Turkey, was one of the bases. And of course, Abraham himself, as I mentioned in one of the previous episodes, travels from the south, from Ur the Chaldees up into the north to Haran. And there's an Amorite connection there. And the Amorites begin to populate southern Mesopotamia sometime in the late third millennium. And their language wasn't written down, or at least as far as we can tell, although we just found an Amorite Akkadian lexicon, like a dictionary, very recently, and so there must have been something going on, but the language was close enough that if you're an Amorite, you're probably going to write in Akkadian. Perhaps it would be like somebody in the Middle Ages who's either Italian or French or Spanish, but they're still writing in Latin. It's the base language. The analogy isn't perfect, by the way, but anyway. So we have, and by the way, the Amorites will begin to populate much of southern Mesopotamia, and Amorites will take over certain cities. For example, Uruk has an Amorite king in the Old Babylonian period, which is a little bit after 2000 BC. Babylon, by the way, the dynasty there will have Amorite who kings will trace their lineage to an Amorite background. Of course, the most famous of all of these kings is Hammurabi. Even in the north, the Assyrians will connect themselves with an Amorite heritage. In fact, even have some common ancestors with the Babylonians. And in fact, they identify themselves with their cities. And so now, though it's an Amorite stronghold, the people from Ashur call themselves Assyrians. Those in Babylon call themselves Babylonians. And so, but they become firmly entrenched in the Sumero-Akkadian civilization. So the Hammurabi's Babylon, he traces himself with an Amorite lineage. It is hard to know how conscious people were aware of this, and so it's not as if you recognize that you have this the Sumerian heritage and I have an Akkadian heritage. There doesn't seem to be any of that. In fact, it's interesting, the scholars did see that between the world wars, but I think a lot of it had to do with the whole issue of ethnicity. And so after World War II, a lot of scholars, some German, etc., began to distance themselves from the whole issue of individual ethnicity in the area, because it looked as if you wanted to be a Mesopotamian, you basically adopted much of the attributes of Mesopotamian civilization. So now, just to make it even more complicated, by the late Bronze Age, so let's say 1400 or so, we have another people group that begins to make themselves known in southern Mesopotamia. They're called the Kassites. By the way, this ite at the end of the word, this of course isn't anglicizing the name. Of course, that's sort of a King Jamesian type of thing that they did. We've kept it, but the Kassites are probably from northern Iran and the north, and so they become we begin to see Kassite mercenaries in the Old Babylonian period, Kassite personal names. The language doesn't appear to have ever been written down, but it's another one that's completely unrelated to any other language groups, as far as we can tell. They will basically ruled Babylon for the longest time from around 1500 and change down to about 1100 and change, 1100, 1150s or so. And it's the longest running dynasty of Babylon. And by the way, the Kassites were Babylonians. They adopt the Babylonian pantheon. They will add some of their own. Personal gods are Kassite, and so we have some Kassite person names, Kassite divine names, and that's about all we know about their language. I don't recall if that anyone even makes a sentence in Kassite to bring it up. I'll have to look that up to see. It happens in Amorite, but not Kassite. Amorite, at least, is a Semitic language as far as we can tell. Kassite is not. Hope you're taking notes. So the Kassites are here. They're a pretty stable group. And by the way, in this late Bronze Age period, with the late Bronze Age, typically around 1600 to around 1200 BC, we have a number of major kingdoms throughout the Near East. Egypt is very powerful at this time. The Hittites in Turkey, the Assyrians, and Hurrians. The Hurrian kingdom is called Mitanni in northern Syria, and then Babylon in the south. And they basically are sort of a fellowship of kingdoms that kind of like the kingdoms in Europe, let's say before the 19th century. They're either on very good terms or very bad terms, but they're always interacting with each other. And when there's a breakdown, there's war. We actually have international relations between these kingdoms. And there's even an international language at the time, and it's Akkadian. So even if an Egyptian pharaoh writes to a Hittite prince in 1300, they're writing back and forth to each other in Akkadian, okay, which neither of them know, but their scribes would be trained in it. In fact, in the land of the Hittites, which is in central Turkey, we will often find a letter written in Hittite as a draft, but then a final draft is written in Akkadian. So in other words, I'm a Hittite scribe. My own language is Hittite. It might be Luvian, but we won't worry about that. But you're writing in your language, and so you've got your test tablet here, and from there you're going to derive the international one that you'll be sending down to the other scribes. And of course, international language it's the earliest one attested, but we'll have later on Aramaic, by the way, becomes an international language in the Middle East. It's probably the language that Jesus would have spoken. Greek becomes an international language throughout the Roman Empire. In fact, in the New Testament, when you hear the word Greek, it often simply means anybody who's not Jewish is a Greek, because that's the international language. In other words, if I want to speak to you and neither of us know each other's language, we would use our third world Greek or ESL Greek to talk to each other. And then, of course, French, and of course today English, or if you think about it, ESL English is the language of the world if you want to interact. So Akkadian is the first one. Pretty cool. When I would teach Akkadian, one of my advertisements was learn the first international language. I don't know how many people bit because of that, by the way, but anyway. So the Kassites, though they are not indigenous to the area, adopt Mesopotamian attributes. Of course, there must be a Kassite flavor to it, but I couldn't tell you what it was, because the Kassites are probably the best purveyors of Mesopotamian civilization. Their scribes began copying lots of the literature from the past. And by the way, you think about it, here we are in 1200 BC. Writing has already been going on for well over 2 millennia. And so for them, early writing is ancient. Of course, for us, you might be thinking, well, it's all the same. It's just really, really old. But, the Greeks, for us, we're closer in time to the Greeks than the Greeks are to the beginning of writing. So if you think of it from that standpoint, the first half of history was already completed by the time we get to the classical Greeks. Pretty intimidating if you think about it. We're on on that trail. And I would joke with my classes that, since I study this early stuff, that anything past the fall of the Roman Empire is just current events. But That was a joke that sort of ran its course very early, by the way, but I had to bring it up again. So, and that was 476 AD is when, of course, Rome fell. And by the way, I want to stop for a second. In dealing with all this paraphernalia and micro stuff, remember, and I brought this up before, but I think I need to remind myself and the audience that we're doing this to try to understand God's Bible. And if we understand God's Bible better, then of course we can understand Him better. And so if this could be a great hobby and you could do it for its own sake, but if you're doing that, you're going to miss out on something. And so remember, when you study this, you're studying it to understand the Bible better, and by understanding the Bible better, you're understanding God better, and so you can commune with Him. And so keep that in mind. I have to constantly keep that in my mind. It's very easy for me to lapse into a hobby and, jump into the weeds and then have to be taken out of the weeds once in a while, maybe even to the woodshed. So, uh, so the reminder is not so much for you, but it's for me. So anyway, so the Kassites continue on for about half a millennium as the longest running dynasty. After that, we have two major people groups that will continue on. They will wax and wane in power. The Assyrians in the north, the Babylonians in the south. They will have less of them and less of a connection with their early Amorite heritage, and certainly the Kassite heritage is somewhat rejected for the indigenous groups. And what does that mean? Sumero-Akkadian. It's almost irrelevant by, let's say, 1000 BC. And by the way, in Egypt, pretty much the norm is the security of singular pharaonic headship. And so Egypt is usually centralized. Now, it's not always, but it's more common to have a centralized power in Egypt. In Mesopotamia, it's probably more common to have decentralization. So, the kingdom of Hammurabi, by the way, which was around in the 18th century BC, that was an anomaly. Hammurabi was successful in conquering pretty much the entire Tigris-Euphrates basin. But even in sort of an anecdotal letter from a city called Mari in the north, which Hammurabi captured, and it was a good thing that he captured it because he burned it, and 20,000 tablets and fragments were sort of baked and left there. And this was in Syria. There was an anecdotal note where one king happens to mention, well, by the way, Hammurabi has this many kings under him, but the king of Aleppo, he's got the most. And that would be really cool, except that Aleppo, since there's a modern town there, it has defied full excavation. So we would really like to find an archive in Aleppo to see what was going on there, because if it was more powerful than, let's say, the kingdom of Babylon, the reason that we don't know about it is because we haven't been able to excavate it. If those people would simply leave for about 100 years so we could, dig our teeth into it, but that's not going to happen. The same problem with Jerusalem, with Damascus, and in other places that you can't just excavate anywhere you feel like it. And of course, we wouldn't want that to happen in our country either. So Hammurabi, his kingdom is actually at its full extent really only under Hammurabi and his successor, Samsu-Iluna, and then it begins to break down politically speaking. And by the time of the last king of the Hammurabi dynasty, which is another century or so later, basically it's simply the city of Babylon and nothing else. And I remember in one class once I was talking about the fact that, well, Babylon was defeated and captured by a Hittite raid in 1595 BC. And then the Hittites left, and a student raised his hand and said, "How do you know that?" I said, "You're not going to like this answer." And they said, "Why not?" Because we have a sentence in a Babylonian chronicle that mentions the fact that Babylon was captured by the Hittites, and we have a note in a Hittite prayer from a king that mentions the Hittite raid. So it's about a paragraph total that mentions it. He says, that's it? I said, yes. And so if you have anybody writing in a book more than that paragraph, they're making it up. That's all we have about the Hittite raid on Babylon. The Hittites, for whatever reason, were not able to capitalize on their raid. They conquered the city or captured the god. By the way, you want to conquer a city, you capture the city god, you take it from its temple and you remove it and take it somewhere else. But my main point here is that politically speaking, Mesopotamia is usually pretty much decentralized. There's very rarely a central power. So Babylon was the central power for only about 2 generations in the 18th century BC, and that really doesn't happen again until the Assyrians. About 500 years later, the Assyrians began to have a powerful kingdom. By the way, we historians like things in 3, and so there's an Old Assyrian period, a Middle Assyrian, and a Neo-Assyrian. Same thing with Babylon, Old, Middle, New, and late, early Bronze, Middle Bronze, Late Bronze, and so there must be a thing with these 3s. I suppose it's nice and orderly. What do you do when you're done with the late period? You just add another one, but you don't want to add a 4th one because that would just be wrong. Even in Egypt, Old, Middle, New Kingdom. So, and it's sort of hard to break out of these molds, by the way. It's sort of scary too, I suppose. So, it's really not until the end of what we would consider Mesopotamian civilization that we have political superpowers. And the first one would be late or Neo-Assyrian kingdom, the Neo-Assyrians. And I'm going to have a map that I'll be able to show all of you at some point. But by the 8th century BC, the Assyrians will conquer the entirety of the Middle East. And of course, this is known in the Bible that they're the bad guys in the book of Second Kings. They're clearly the ones that will be laying siege to everyone everywhere. And so the Assyrians um, by the end of the 9th century, and then even more fully in the 8th century, and I'm really sort of giving you an overview now, will rule over all of what would be present-day Iraq, much of, I would say, almost all of Western Iran, a good part of Turkey into even northeastern Turkey. They will butt up against a kingdom called Urartu. If that sounds familiar, it's biblical Ararat, by the way. And the Urartians are another people group who employed the cuneiform script, but they modified it for their own purposes. And it looks like whoever they were, they have connections with the people who used to live there. I brought up before the Hurrians, but that was 1,000 years earlier. But anyway, the Assyrians will go deep into Turkey. They will invade and conquer most of Palestine. And they'll conquer the northern kingdom of Israel. The Bible is very explicit about this. In fact, one of the earliest cuneiform translations that was made in the 1850s was shocking to the Victorian world when they had an inscription of Sargon, who's mentioned in Isaiah chapter 20, verse 1. I think it's the only time he's even mentioned in the Bible. By the way, his name, Sargon, is the Hebraicized form of Sharukinu or Sharumkinum, which means the just king or the right king or whatever. And by the way, if you call yourself the correct or the right king, it probably means you're a usurper. It's certainly not the name that mom and dad gave him when he was born. It's a throne name, and he probably was a usurper, by the way. And there's a famous Sargon 1,500 years before him who, again, called himself the true king. Of course, if I came into my classroom every day and said, I want to make sure I'm the professor of the class, you would either think I had, a personality complex, or there was an issue about whether I'm really the professor or not. And so Anyway, Sargon um, claims to have conquered the northern kingdom of Israel in his inscription. And that was amazing to find because, of course, the Victorians began to realize, oh, these Bible stories actually might have a historical truth to them. But there was a little problem because in the Bible, the conquest of Israel was given to the king, the previous king of the dynasty, Shalmaneser, who is mentioned in Assyrian records, and he's the king before Sargon. He might have been a brother. We just don't know. And the guess now is that the Bible is giving full credit to Shalmaneser for the siege. They do not give it to Sargon. Sargon claims it all by himself, but is probably exaggerating. Shalmaneser died. We're not exactly sure how, but somewhat unexpectedly, and we don't know how Sargon took over. There's no cuneiform text telling us, but we know he takes over. So there's a there seems to be a superficial contradiction there, but I think it's pretty easily resolved when you look at it from a political standpoint. But the Assyrian Empire will be the ruling bad guy in the Middle East for about a century and a half until around 612 BC, rather abruptly. In fact, if you've ever read the book of Nahum in the Bible, it's a 3-chapter little book that basically is gleeful about the fall of Assyria. And you're thinking, what am I supposed to get out of this? This doesn't sound very nice. Why are they so happy? And I suppose, can you imagine being somebody Jewish and you've just found out that Hitler committed suicide and the Nazis have just given up? You would be basically, thank you, God, for, conquering my enemies. We are so grateful for how you've defeated them. And of course, you look at what are called imprecatory psalms, where the writer is sort of uncomfortable for us, but they're sort of gleeful over the destruction of God's enemies. But I suppose what you have to say, until you're in there, it's sort of hard to stomach. But if you were one of those who lost families or saw your entire city blow up in flames, you want justice. And so I'm not going to be, I'm not going to be a judge of them. But anyway, so the book of Nahum describes the fall of Nineveh, which is now found in cuneiform records, and they're roughly in agreement. We'll probably talk about this later, but the Assyrians even talk about mounting a siege of Jerusalem against the southern kingdom, but they don't talk about its defeat. And of course, the Bible in 2 Kings 18 and 19 go to great lengths about the Assyrians not being able to take the city of Jerusalem because God protected it. And of course, I shouldn't say of course here, but the Bible provides a theological response to a historical event. God protected us, and he brought his angel down, and his angel protected us. The events themselves are roughly the same as what the Assyrians are talking about, except that they, of course, have very, very different perspectives on this. When the Assyrians fell, there was unfortunately, the political vacuum was taken over by a southern group in Babylon. They call themselves Chaldeans, but they're known as Babylonians again. But they're a Semitic people group, perhaps connected to the Arameans, and perhaps not. We're just not entirely sure. And the most famous of all those kings is Nebuchadnezzar, who was, again, another one of the bad guys in the Bible who conquers and destroys Jerusalem. And so he's very, very well known, and that conquest is at the end of the book of 2 Kings. In fact, it might even be the reason why Kings is written down like, God, why did you allow this to happen? Everything is gone. Everything is destroyed. And, if you've ever read the end of the book of 2 Kings, it ends on a high note. Yes, God has taken everything away from us except his holy book, the thing that we've ignored. But the descendant of David is been in chains in Babylon, Jehoiakim, and he's been let out, and we're hoping happy days are coming up. But the writer didn't know what was going to happen next, and so we have a pretty good idea about when the Second Kings is written down, somewhere, late in the 6th century, with the hope of good times happening. And of course, there will be good times, but not the way that they had expected it. Um, the Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar was not nearly as big as the Assyrian ones. The Assyrians actually conquered Egypt. Babylon tried to do that. In the Bible, even alludes to the fact that they could not do it in poetic accounts in the especially Ezekiel. But when Babylon falls, a kingdom, a people group in a kingdom which was not based in Mesopotamia would take over Mesopotamia, the Persians, the Medo-Persian Empire, which is well known, of course, in Greek stories because of Herodotus talking about the great war between the Greeks and the Persians. The Persians would create the largest land empire in the history of the world up to that time, stretching from the Indus Valley all the way to Libya, and of course into Greece, where they were blocked at the Battle of Marathon and other things made famous in classical sources. And by the way, this is where the biblical and classical materials begin to finally interact, at least chronologically speaking. However, the Persian Empire worked very hard to make sure that Mesopotamian civilization continued on in the same way. In fact, the Persian understanding of kingship is definitely dependent upon the Mesopotamian concept of kingship. Though Persian was used as a language, the written language for commerce was Aramaic. Unfortunately, Aramaic was not being written down in cuneiform, and so we have very little of it left at this point. So, and by the way, the Persians, now another people group, wrote in an Indo-European language. The Medes were another Indo-European people group. We unfortunately that do not have material written in a Median language. So we just have an amalgamation of people groups. It's bewildering and very intimidating. And by the way, I'm just scratching the surface. There are actually a number of other smaller groups that employed the cuneiform script or the alphabetic script. And I think I mentioned it briefly, the alphabetic script is now going, there is evidence of the alphabetic script going back much earlier than we had ever anticipated, into the middle of the 3rd millennium. And so what we thought we knew is either just flat out wrong or just the tip of the iceberg. And of course, that's what we're going to find out with all of this stuff, is that I'm not trying to prove anything here. I'm simply trying to understand the Bible better. And as soon as I do that, hopefully it matures my understanding of things and helps me deepen my understanding of how God acted throughout time. But the last thing I'm going to be when I do this is dogmatic about it, because tomorrow something's going to happen, or I'm going to learn something, or somebody else is going to, figure something out that we just didn't know before. So those are the main people groups, and it's bewildering. There are actually a number of really nice books that put this all together. The best one when I was a student was by Georges Roux, Roux, imaginatively called Ancient Iraq. Unfortunately, it is certainly out of date now, but the general overview of what he writes is good. You can actually find it as a PDF file online because it's an older book. I think it was updated in the 90s, and he originally wrote it in the late 60s. But it's a best overview, very well written summary. If you want to look at an overview of Mesopotamian civilization, the classic book was by a fellow by the name of Oppenheim, not Oppenheimer, Oppenheim, A.L. Oppenheim, uh, and very imaginatively called ancient Mesopotamia. Who knew? And this was originally written in the 1960s, but it really, and one of his chapters is why a history of Mesopotamian religion cannot be written. He was trying to show you that we really don't understand this very well, and so to try to give you an overview of things is sort of um, problematic to say the least. So this is bewildering. Um, if we have more time, I can probably now venture into talking a little bit about the civilization itself from the tablets. And so this is going to be a very gross overview. So, probably you've seen this. This is an average size cuneiform tablet. This happens to have been found at the site that I worked at, the first site I worked at called Terqa, Terqa. It's on the Middle Euphrates River in Syria, north of the Iraqi border, about an hour plus by car. Terqa is not mentioned in the Bible, but it was an ancient kingdom, old Babylonian period. In fact, they interacted with Babylon, usually not in a pleasant way, by the way. Um, um, and I don't know the exact amount, but I'm guessing upwards to about 1 million clay tablets have been uncovered from the 19th century to the present. And even before then, tablets were being found. If you're a farmer in Iraq or Syria, if you begin plowing, chances are you'll plow up some tablets. Okay, tablets could be found just about anywhere. By the way, people didn't bury them, of course. What happens, of course, is the sands of time. You might have an archive or a library. There actually were private libraries and public ones. But since this is the primary, this is what you find in southern Iraq. They really don't have a lot of good natural resources except clay. And so when they decided to start writing, and I brought this up in a previous episode, they employed clay. Clay, if you dry it, it will last. And if it happens to be buried in the ground over the accumulation of dust or simply because of burial or what have you, they can last at least 5,000 years. Now, an unbaked tablet is no easy thing to excavate out of the ground. If you notice that one is beginning to pop out, you have to pretty much stop what you're doing, use a dental pick and a blower, and spend a long time. It could be sometimes up to hours trying to excavate the thing because one false move with a dental pick and it could be, completely destroyed. If the tablet was something important, a ruler or someone else might decide to have them put into an oven and baked, and so they would last longer. You could use other media for that. We know of tablets written on silver and on wax, on other media. We rarely, if ever, have ever found any, of course, wax and even wood, but of course, those aren't going to last very long. Just like you think about it today, if you've got a really cool library with, thousands of books, they're written, in paper, etc. You think anybody's going to find it in 5000 AD? Not at all. But they will find your stone inscriptions. If you have a building and it has no smoking inscribed on the side or whatever, or, the Seaward building or whatever it says, and it's, chiseled in there, that's going to last a really, really long time. So baked tablets last longer, but of course, most tablets are unbaked. But like I said, we might have 1 million. Nobody knows the exact answer. Maybe half of them or more are written in the Akkadian language that I talked about before. Not just in Iraq and Syria, but in Anatolia. Of all places, we have a couple hundred Akkadian tablets in Egypt because they were found at Tel El Amarna. That's the Arabic name of the Egyptian capital during the part of the Bronze Age. It was their dead letter office, and there were copies of international relationships. And by the way, if I'm sending you out a tablet, if it's important, I might make my own copy. But of course, most of the stuff that I have are incoming tablets from others, unless I have copies. And so, um, so if I send you, if you're a king of the Hittite king, and I send you a scathing letter, if I find it in the Hittite archive, chances are I don't have the response. Because it just didn't have the response come in. So anyway, maybe 500,000 in Akkadian, maybe more. We have tablets in Elamite in southwestern Iran, Sumerian, maybe 100,000, maybe more. And of course, I told you that Sumerian is a very, very difficult language, um, uh, unrelated to any of these others. And I brought it up before, but it bears repeating. Genesis 10 describing the multitude of people groups, and then Genesis 11 about the explanation for why there are, multiple confusion of languages, is very historical in terms of their awareness of the fact that there were a multitude of people groups, and this is their theological explanation for it. That this is what God did to confuse the people groups, but it doesn't deny the fact that it was a realia in the ancient Near East. They well understood that there were multiple people groups with languages that were unrelated, and this was their explanation for it. So anyway, what would you do to write a tablet? You would take a piece of somewhat wet clay, and you would use a stylus, which would look something like a pen or a pencil, and you began making indentations on it. And the earliest script, and I began bringing this up at the end of one of the hours, is at the beginning it was pictographic, but in other words, if I want to write about a sheep, I would draw something that looked like a sheep or whatever. But if I want to write it in a real language and use the grammar of that language, I had to learn to use abstract forms. And so even though these pictographs were continuing to be used, they had actual multiple meanings. And so, for example, Sumerian was primarily, these scripts became abstract in what we call sumerograms, wordgrams. Akkadian was a language that adopted the script, but for their language, they had to make it more syllabic. And I don't want to go into all the reasons for that unless somebody asks me. And so each sign, and there were usually a couple hundred of them, although not all of them were used in every period. And so when I learned cuneiform script, I had to, be aware that if I was reading a text, what period is this? What, the script, and the script changes or modifies over time, which was really disappointing to the novice student to find that out. But of course, even our script is changed, over time. Just to give you an example, I teaching at University of Wisconsin at La Crosse, we would have undergraduate seminars at the end of every semester. And I remember one day a student he's doing a paper on local La Crosse history, and he had a handwritten, on the screen, he had a handwritten copy. It was basically cursive script from the early, late 19th century, and he couldn't read it because, of course, here we are in the early part of the 21st century, and handwriting, of course, is becoming a lost art. And it was funny. Some of us old people up there said, "Oh, we can read that. It's such and such," and it was sort of a running joke, because, of course, we were, in my age, you were trained in handwriting. It doesn't mean I handwrite very well, but today, what do you handwrite? Your signature and maybe nothing else. So the script has changed and been modified over time. Cuneiform all the more so over time. And like I said, different languages would modify the script even more. The Hittites modified the script tremendously. So anyway, back to this one sample. How are we doing for time?
We're good.
Okay. So this, of these million tablets, and like I said, the script would be used. Each sign could take on a syllabic meaning. And when I say syllabic, I mean a syllable, usually either consonant, vowel, vowel, consonant. So that would be like a ka or an ak, or a consonant vowel consonant, cock, rarely, if ever, in a vowel consonant vowel. But anyway, that's another story. And so each script, each sign could take on a syllabic form, a word form, or even earlier pictographic form. And so it, you don't know which one is being used in which context. And I don't know. I'm trying to figure out if there's any analogy with ours. And I suppose it's, we're sort of trained as little kids with our language, but now that I look back at it, I'm wondering what would happen if when you're learning your ABCs, and of course you're learning your ABC, and all of a sudden C, how do you pronounce the word C? It sounds like an S, and all of a sudden C is for car. Well, why is C for car? C doesn't sound like ka. Can you imagine some 3 or 4-year-old or 5-year-old saying, "Mommy, that doesn't sound the same"? You'd be what would you say to them? Have you ever heard the story about the word ghoti?
Mm-mm.
Okay, ghoti. What does that? How do you think you pronounce that?
You tell me.
No, I want you to tell me.
Spell it again.
Ghoti.
Ghoti.
Yeah, of course. No, you're completely wrong. Well, you're so wrong. It's just, how about fish? Okay. By the way, this is George Bernard Shaw making fun of the English language. GH, how do you pronounce GH in the word TOUGH? Tough. Yeah.
Tough.
So GH as in O as in women. You don't say woman, you say women. So and then the TI, nation, NATION. So the whole point of it is to show that our script doesn't really match up very well with our language. We borrowed it. And so it's sort of a mess. And it really makes it hard for somebody who's learning English as a second language. Try to figure out how to pronounce the word twelve, TWELVE. You're sort of raised with it if you're indigenous, English language speaker, but somebody from the outside. Well, the cuneiform script is just as bad times infinity.
Yeah.
In the sense that the scribes knew the language. It's hard to know at the level of what the average person. In other words, if you're not a scribe, did you know cuneiform? And the answer is you could probably look at some things here and there. You could, but you probably weren't trained in it any more than, let's say you're a lawyer and you give me a legal text to look at it. I'm probably going to look at it and say, well, I know a lot of these words, but I've never seen them put together like this. I have no idea what this means. Help me. I'm going to pay you to tell me what this means. So, in fact, we actually have a lot of non-scribes writing cuneiform in central Turkey in the late 3rd millennium. They're Assyrian merchants, and they sort of took the script and simplified it for themselves. And so, for example, if you have the ba sign, it can also be the pa sign. A ba and pa are related. I mean, think about it. What's the difference between B and P? One is voiced and one is unvoiced. Okay, I know. I never really thought about stuff like this, but that's voice. Okay, but you're using the same thing. And by the way, I remember talking with my Arabic friends, and I remember one time one of my Arabic friends we were in Syria, and he's speaking used to it. He says, "Mark, I have to go, but I'll meet you at the bark." I said, "Bark? Where's the bark?" He didn't have a P in his language. I mean,
Yep.
and so there's okay, and I had to realize that I had the same issue speaking Arabic. They would divide some consonants that I didn't divide, like the letter T. They have about 3 different versions of it, but that's another story, which I've probably said already. Anyway, so the cuneiform script, I know it looks like a chicken will have walked across the tablet, but as it's wet, they would be very economical and use the entire tablet. At the beginning, it looked as if the writing system was used for memory purposes. memory loss. The culture became much too complex at that early city of Uruk um, in the late fourth millennium. Way too much is going on, and so I'm guessing that writing was for memory purposes. I just can't keep up with everything. I've got this sheep shearing business, and I just don't know how many clients I have, and so somebody's got to figure out how to make a system of notation that I can remember. I can look at this and say, aha, I have 150 clients. Good. I got them all listed. And you're in arrears. You need to pay up. And how do I know that? Because I've got it on my tablet. What the eerie thing about this is when we have the script, um, it looks as if it's already been in use for a while. It's already being used in other areas. Uh, And so there's already a network of cuneiform writing at this point. It does seem to take a while before they begin to realize that if we want, we can start writing down our poetry, etc. And probably some of this is happening at the end of the third millennium when Sumerian has probably died out as a language. And so the way to recuperate things is to put it, in writing permanent. And so, um, in fact, it's the old Babylonian scribes under Hammurabi and his predecessors and successors they're scribes who have probably no longer know Sumerian as a spoken language are now copying things and even copying inscriptions from the period of 500 years before them. And so we have old Babylonian copies of Sargon's Akkadian kingdom. Um, Very few of them are from Sargon himself, but they've been faithfully copied by scribes. Why they're copying them down, we're not entirely sure, but we're glad that they did. They're copying down literature from earlier periods that we would have never had if they hadn't copied them. And so, in fact, the corpus of Sumerian literature is about the size of the Old Testament. It's gigantic. Unfortunately, it's very fragmentary in nature, and so it's really hard um, um, uh, to fully understand. But maybe we'll talk about that with the Gilgamesh epic and other things as we move on. So anyway, but most tablets are administrative in nature; they're bookkeeping, and so at some point we want to we can talk about this particular tablet and what it means.
Awesome. Well, yeah, we'll take a break on this episode, and we'll actually be coming back with a part 4, where it's gonna be kind of a quick overview, some questions, wrestle through some of the stuff to get a clearer understanding for us out there, try to connect with what Mark is saying, and then how to then take that, apply it to the biblical text itself. So, yeah, this was great. It was awesome, and we'll be back for the next part. But as always, thank you so much for tuning in. If you do have questions, please let us know below. We'll have some information and some different textbooks that we've mentioned on the podcast linked below. So feel free to check those out. Otherwise, make sure to like and subscribe and let us know if you have any specific questions for Mark.
Great.
We'll see you next time.